So that's enough of me talking about all the Harris Center stuff. I have the great pleasure of introducing a fabulous birder and an incredible educator. We're so lucky to have Phil Brown as a full staff member at the Harris Center. He manages Pack Monadnock Raptor Observatory and Kestrel monitoring programs, and there's more programs to come. You might have noticed in our recent calendar, we're starting a saw-whet monitoring program, saw-whet owls, that is. And Phil is really behind all of that. He's the director of our bird conservation area at the Harris Center, and we are just so lucky to have him. And tonight, you're all in for a treat. Phil really knows his raptors. So Phil, take it away.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome, Susie. Yeah, I got to talk about one of my favorite topics. So, all right, thanks everybody for joining. I'll be talking about the migratory raptors that are migrating right now over Pack Monadnock Mountain in the Monadnock region of New Hampshire and elsewhere in the Northeast and really all around the world right now in many places. So the raptors of Pack Monadnock will be the focus. I will cover identification tips and natural history, going kind of brief into most of these areas, touching on conservation, and I'm talking about a little bit of some of the special Harris Center connections to these raptors now, and answer a variety of questions. So we'll get to take a close look, or at least a quick look, at all of the species pictured here on the panel, which is the interpretive panel that you'll see if you take a trip up to Pack Monadnock Mountain at Miller State Park. But first, we'll have to answer a few questions, and this presentation will attempt to answer some of these, such as, why do we do this? What is the purpose of hawk watching, raptor monitoring? What is New Hampshire's role in determining raptor populations? How are they faring overall? And a little bit about where they're going, where they're coming from. We're all curious about that when we see them flying over. So the first thing I'd like to start with is identifying what raptors are, really defining them. And a classic textbook definition usually gives you a few categories, such as they have killing talons, and they have a hooked beaks or bills, keen eyesight, and they are all carnivores. So you can see the image at the bottom of the screen here, showing those sharp, fierce talons for grabbing prey, the hooked bill for ripping prey apart. And they do have incredible vision. They can see at great distances, tiny little movements, and they're super fast and amazing predators. So most of what we'll be talking about today will be hawks, eagles, falcons, and then a few of the other diurnal flying daytime birds of prey. These would be harriers and kites and ospreys and things like that. I won't really focus on owls, even though they are also raptors. Most owls, but not all, are nocturnal around here. So we're not really going to dive into owls, but once in a while we actually do see an owl from the Raptor Observatory. So let's talk a little bit about migration monitoring in general. Basically, the best way of effectively measuring populations and determining change are these standardized long-term counts of migrating raptors that have been done for many decades in some cases around the Western Hemisphere, looking at initially a baseline of what was flying over, establishing numbers from season to season, and then over the decades, as the number of hawkwatch sites have grown, we've learned about population change. We've been able to determine migration patterns and learn about a whole range of other variables that relate to conservation of these species. And the Harris Center and I firmly believe that education is one of the really key steps on this path to conservation. And there's really no better place for kids to get their start as conservationists than coming up to Pack Monadnock. And it's really fun, it's engaging, it captivates people of all ages, and it's quite meaningful and has benefits to us as well as the raptors. conservation of these species is imperiled by several threats. Globally, at least half of raptors from recent studies have been shown to be declining. That's a pretty alarming number, 52%, and 18% are threatened with extinction worldwide. Locally, more regionally, about half the species show declines in the New Hampshire area. And there are lots of threats that are really tangible. A few that are pictured here on the bottom. Obviously, roads is one of them. Collisions is a major killer of raptors. They fly into things, they get hit by cars. They have amazing vision, but they're not always looking out peripherally or directly ahead of them. So they will end up striking windows and colliding with things like structures. Wind turbines come to mind, but they're probably a little bit less of an impact locally since we don't have a lot of wind development in the Northeast. But pesticide use and habitat loss are some pretty major factors. Formerly, the picture on the right shows a whole slew of dead broad-winged hawks from Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania. And these birds were being shot out of the sky just because that was sport back in up to the 1930s or so and beyond. This was happening in the Northeast as well, in places probably like Pack Monadnock. So thankfully, raptors are now protected by lots of different laws. They're all protected species. You can't just go out blasting them away anymore, but there were actually bounties on some of these raptors until just a few decades ago. So thankfully, the conservation movement has helped, but they face other new threats. Climate change is one that comes to mind, which has all sorts of impacts that we're still trying to get our minds around and try to predict. Here we go. Looking at New Hampshire's breeding raptors, of which there are more species than this listed. Several of these, about half of them, are on some sort of state conservation list, such as endangered, threatened, or special concern. You can see here on the list, the northern harrier, one of the endangered species, probably only just a handful of pairs left. And that is determined by a project that's looking at nesting harriers up in the northern part of the state. Golden eagles are really extirpated from the state at this point. They don't breed in New Hampshire anymore. They haven't been documented in about 6 decades. Peregrine falcons have made a great comeback, have come off of the endangered lists, both locally in New Hampshire and federally, but they're still considered threatened. And bald eagles, likewise, have been bumped down in a way to special concern, which is the least concern of the 3 categories here. Unfortunately, the other direction, American kestrels, which were formerly common decades ago, are now we're concerned about their population status. So let's take a look at the map of where raptors are being monitored at different hawk watch sites around the Western Hemisphere. There are now there are 8 countries that are monitoring raptors in an official way, reporting their data to the website hawkcount.org. There are about 220 sites around the Western Hemisphere, most of which you can see are fairly well clustered in the Northeast. And think about why that might be the case. A lot of conservationists, hawk watchers, people in general live in this very populated area. And this is also where Hawk Mountain was founded in 1934 in Pennsylvania. It was the first location that began conserving migratory raptors in this way and doing these long-term annual counts. So a lot of sites just sprung out from there, but little by little, these voids are being filled. The Rockies in the west, the Mississippi River area also are great pathways of migration. Really the East Coast, though, it's the Atlantic Ocean, the Great Lakes as major barriers to migration, which means there are bottlenecks and form these excellent locations to watch migration happening. But in the East Coast, it's also the Appalachian Mountains running from Maine to Georgia, 2,000 miles or so. And that's a major funnel for migratory raptors. So long-term monitoring is really conducted by a handful of sites around the U.S. mostly. But as the decades have gone on, we can see that more hawk watches have popped up, and in the last 20 years or so, probably nearly 200 of those have popped up. So, and these are ones that are being sustained, much like Pack Monadnock, which is our local New Hampshire hawk watch. We've been conducting monitoring since 2005, so this is the 18th consecutive year, and it's a major contributing site to this tool called the Raptor Population Index, which is a collaboration of these research organizations that came together to determine a tool that tracks raptor populations based on metrics that I won't get into now, but Pack is one of 65 different locations that was chosen as part of this analysis. So the hawks that we're seeing really do mean something in a global population sense. We can make these assessments based on hawks that we're seeing from year to year and changes that are occurring. And basically what we found from this RPI analysis, the last of which was completed in 2019, was that it's a kind of a mixed bag for raptors. A few are increasing, as we mentioned, the eagle, the peregrine falcon. Quite a few are still considered stable, like the red-shouldered hawk, which nests locally, the broad-winged hawk, and turkey vulture. But about half of the species that we look at in the East are seemingly decreasing. At least the migratory populations are decreasing. And these are really familiar species to a lot of people. The osprey, the fishhawk, red-tailed hawk, very common along roadsides and highways. And you might think, oh, I'm seeing plenty of those. They're doing just fine. But there are subtle changes, and I'll get a little bit more into those as I move through this presentation. So there is reason for concern. There's been a lot of concern about migratory birds in general, and lots of groups are tracking their conservation status and very concerned about a handful of birds in general. We heard about the 3 billion birds project a few years ago, where 3 billion birds were determined to be we've lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years overall. So there've been a lot of alarm bells going off about bird conservation, and hawks, they're not immune to it, although hawks are considered overall fairly stable, but species by species, there are lots of declining species. So we'll get into that. But,
Phil, Doris had a question, and she wondered about black vultures.
Oh yeah, I will get into black vultures. Good question.
Great.
I'll mention that towards the end of the presentation.
Great. And Kathy's wondering if you will be discussing, or can you please discuss, like the best spots on Pack or mountains and kind of the best conditions of hawk watching,
Oh, yeah.
when to go out.
Okay. This is that slide actually. So yeah, we'll talk right about that. So when to look, where to look. Right now, this weather is very conducive. As the winds have shifted to the north, the air is dry. We have a high pressure system over much of the East Coast and the Northeast especially. And that followed a cold front that passed through the Northeast a couple of nights ago. And usually the day or two following the passage of a cold front is going to be best for migration at this time of the year in the fall. So mid-September, which we're in now, until mid-October is the peak for most of the species that we see, but they all have slightly different timetables. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And that depends on a range of things like their food conditions. Where to look? Yeah, we did talk a little bit in the beginning about different hawk watches that are in the Northeast, but generally a north-south facing ridge, like where Pack is located. It's a 20-mile long ridge. This is helping the birds get to where they're traveling to. And I'll talk about how those winds really factor in. Generally, some tips for watching raptor migration. is that raptors are using thermals, which are rising pockets of warm air. So the sun was shining bright the last couple of days. The birds were getting lift off the ground. It helps them get high into the sky and then hopefully catch us a bit of a tailwind like what we had today with west winds, winds that were deflecting upslope and off of the slopes of the mountains, help give the birds additional lift so they can get more height, so they can basically work less hard to get to where they're going. They're expending a lot of energy and they have limited resources along the way. Think about, when you're migrating, when you're traveling somewhere, going from, north from your home to somewhere far away, you're on the road, you might not know the landscape, you might not know where the best places to stop for food are. It's the same thing with migrating raptors. They don't know their landscape as well. There are more threats and challenges. So finding food was one of those major challenges. Basically, getting to where they're going has to be that primary goal. But invariably, they'll be stuck for several days between different types of weather patterns that will stop them, such as rain. If it rains for a couple of days, these birds are likely going to be grounded for the most part, and then wait for those northwest winds to blow again. So the wind conditions are really important. We look for the northern or western component at least on our northeast ridge sites. If the wind speed is a little less strong, like today was very strong wind, the strong winds keep the birds really low and not as many can congregate that way. So while we ended up seeing a lot of hawks today, almost 800 or more actually at Pack, because the wind was so strong, the birds couldn't get up in these thermals as much. So if it weren't that strong, we would have seen even more. But a great day to watch hawks because they were staying so low. And let's see, you had asked another question about locations. I think generally we're looking at the ridge lines. Places with a northern view that's unobstructed are the best locations in the fall because the birds are coming from that direction. You get to stick with them a little bit longer. A day like today when the winds were so strong, the birds might just be zipping past you if you look to the south. So you want to see them coming in for a little bit. Somewhere with a good view to the north and west is best. And so, yeah, here is that location where we spend all this time watching the hawks. This is the setup at Pack Monadnock, which is this long-term research project that the Harris Center staffs. And our host partner is the Division of Natural and Cultural Resources, Division of Parks and Recreation in New Hampshire. And so this is Miller State Park, the summit of Pack Monadnock, a 2,200-foot mountain in southwestern New Hampshire. And the view that you're looking at here, showing a person up on the platform and an owl and the mountains, that's a north view. So we get this long, unobstructed view of birds coming in, often at eye level on days like today when it's nice and windy, but awfully cold up there on a day like today. So there's an observation platform that fits a good-sized crowd and also a big lower area. So a good place for groups to gather, and we host lots of class visits throughout the peak season. There's a school group going up there tomorrow, I know, and we host hundreds of students every year. Everything from preschool to graduate schools come visit us and study the hawk migration and come up there to admire it. But thousands and thousands of visitors each year. We had 6,500 people stop by last year. So we're counting individual people as well as individual hawks. So we're at about 1,000 so far for hawks and people this year. So the race is on. See who wins. Here's our new interpretive panel that's going to be up tomorrow when you come visit. You'll meet a crowd of hawk watchers celebrating some days, a successful day. This was the year they set the state record for a number of migrating hawks. That's 19,000 in one season. So a happy group of volunteers, and sometimes we do celebrate with hawk release events. This year's is apparently all booked up already for Sunday. So we'll see if we get to do another one later in the season, maybe. But the hawk release is a really fun time for people of all ages also to witness rehabilitated raptors getting a chance to fly free. But yeah, this is mostly the scene. You'll see a handful of people up there keeping track of what's coming, counting every migrant, keeping full bird lists, and also counting monarch butterflies, among other things. So overall, what do we see at the Hawk Watch? Looking at this pie, a good chunk of this pie, 3/4 of it, is dominated by one single species. And that one species, the broad-winged hawk, is peaking right now this week. It's always peaking right between the 15th and the 20th of September somewhere. And we will see most likely over 1,000 birds in a day sometime in the next week, maybe multiple days of that. So this happens every year, and it happens at a number of different hawk watch sites all along the Appalachians. As the birds funnel south through Mexico and Central America, that number expands even more, but I'll talk more about broadwings shortly. The second most common species is Sharp-shinned Hawk, and then other species make up about 10 to 15%. A whole bunch of numbers and names here. This is kind of the cast of characters from year to year, with the average count in the middle column, showing those two in bold that are our most common species, but good numbers of other things like red-tailed hawk and bald eagles and other familiar species also number in the hundreds. And then down to the rare golden eagle, which we only see about 8 of per year. And the column on the right shows last year's numbers, some of the highs highlighted in blue, some of the kind of unusually high counts, and then some of the reds, which were unusually low. So I'll give you a second to process that. Okay, get on into the hawks. This is hawk watching, right? What's this bird? Everybody knows this is a bald eagle, right? Even Miles knows this one, right? But what about this, Miles? Is that a bald eagle? So oftentimes this is the best look we would get at a hawk watch. Birds can be far away. We can be picking them up at several miles away. We've determined individual birds that we can see at somewhere in the 10-mile range. Birds that are big like bald eagles can be detected by our 20 to 60 power telescopes at that range. So if we see them and we determine they're migrating, they're going from north to south, and it's the right seasonality for them, we're going to call these migrants and we have to put a name to them. Well, most of the time. So there is always the unidentified column, which we try to avoid, but being honest in our identification abilities, sometimes it's limited. But in order to make these identifications, we use a variety of variables like overall size and shape. That's a major one. It's a little hard to determine size when you're looking at one object in the sky and there's nothing to compare it to, but you get a sense of how the bird moves, its behavior, maybe a little hint of a coloration or a pattern, which is a great clue. And then also watching, is it solo or is it in groups? And together with all these clues, you are a bird detective and you could figure out its identity. So generally, looking at these silhouettes, these are some of the major categories of raptors, showing everything from the huge eagles on top, which have 7-foot wingspans, down to the tiny little falcons, which are only about 10 or 12 inches in height when they're standing. So there's a whole range of 15 or 16 different raptor species that we'll see. And this one picture depicts a little bit of that range here with a tiny little sharp-shinned hawk, which is an accipiter with a long tail, flying after, chasing the bigger red-tailed hawk in this case. Looking at, so that was a good example of behavior. This shows plumage variability. Would you believe it that this is actually the same species? It's not the difference between male and female, but in this case, the difference between an adult red-shouldered hawk on the left and a young one on the right. So they have different plumages depending on how many years they are. And in this case, red-shouldereds, when they're young in the first year or so of life, look like a little more streaky, a little brownish, and they develop they molt into these adult plumage feathers, which are more striking black and white banding on the tail, the red shoulder areas on the underside, a little bit more of the rusty coloration. And that's typical for a lot of our raptors. Bald eagle is a classic example of a bird that takes actually 5 years to reach its adult plumage. So for 5 years, bald eagles can look different from one year to the next. And it can present some identification challenges that I'll jump into later. Oh, here's the example of congregation. This is the species that congregates the most around here. This is the broad-winged hawk. Hopefully tomorrow we'll get to see a little bit of this. The kettling activity, this describes when the birds are circling in a thermal. They're all there for the same reason. They're collecting in the warm air columns that give them the lift they need. Today, those thermals were being broken up by the strong winds, but maybe tomorrow it'll be a little lighter. And on a good day, this is the kind of kettle you can see, maybe 80 or 100 birds strong. So jumping into the species and breaking them down by their individual families within the species, the Buteos are the classic hawks, the red-tailed hawk, broad-winged, red-shouldered. They are medium to large sized in general. Generally, their shape is chunky with broad, shorter tails and long, broad wings that often kind of bow out in the area here called the secondaries, the feathers, or the secondary feathers. This one, a red-tailed hawk, shows a dark brownish belly band, we call it, and dark brown patagial feathers in the front of the wing. These are two distinctive field marks, if you can get a look at that, because they don't always have a red tail. This one does. That means this is a full adult. If you see that, you're really only looking at one species or so, but really the best way at a distance to identify a red-tailed hawk is watching its behavior and seeing how it moves. It's a heavy-bodied bird. It moves rather slowly. Winds can always play a factor in throwing some of those assumptions off, but the way the bird moves is usually fairly true, and its behavior is a characteristic that we're always looking for. So red-tailed hawks will hunt in flight quite a bit. They'll do this little bit of hovering, which is basically a kiting behavior, which means a little bit of flapping in place, kind of steadying themselves so they can narrow their focus down on prey way down below. It's only one of a couple of species that does this at the Hawk Watch, so it's almost a guarantee that it's a red-tailed hawk if we see a hawk kiting in the distance. For each species, I have prepared a series of these images that show on top the seasonal or the yearly trend, showing the number of hawks, the y-axis, by the year. So looking at the range, this shows there are basically between 200 and 600 red-tailed hawks on an annual basis at Pack Monadnock. The graph on the bottom left here shows the RPI trend for the species up to 2019 when the last analysis was done, showing that red-tailed hawks are declining at approximately 7.41% per year in that period of time. So fairly alarming number, but what we're learning is that red-tailed hawks may be not migrating as far anymore because of factors like climate change. They don't have to go as far to find their food. So that's been one big takeaway, and a lot of sites are corroborating that. There have been several studies, especially pairing it with data from Christmas bird counts, showing that, yes, indeed, red-tailed hawks are wintering further north than they used to. So just quickly touching on some of these little tidbits. to make sure I get through all of this. Red-shouldered hawk, very strongly barred overall. We saw this photo earlier. They also have a slightly different way of holding their wings and are a little lighter bodied than the red-tailed hawk, a little more buoyant. A look-alike with the Buteos here. A shapeshifter is the common raven, which is not a raptor, but we see very frequently up at hawk watches and anywhere there's mountains and cliffs. Ravens love to soar around, so vaguely similar, but they're jet black and they have a wedge-shaped tail, and they often do a lot of croaking too, as ravens do. Back to red-shouldered hawk, though, a species on the increase at about 4.6% per year. And we've seen them breaking records in the last several years at Pack. A species that may be expanding its range north and doing well with changing forests. Broad-winged hawk, the last but not the least member of this family. It's the least in size, though. Broadwings have about a 3-foot wingspan, whereas the other two are a little bit longer winged in general. So broadwings have a chunkier appearance because they don't have those super long wings, but the adults have a banded tail, black and white, similar to the red-shouldered hawk adult. The underside is, when they're full adult anyway, has barring going across the chest. And that's typical of adult hawks to have barring, which is basically markings that go horizontally across the bird's chest. So adults have barring, there it is here, kind of a rusty brownish color. But when they're young, they have streaking, and that adds to the confusion. So obviously plumage is not the best characteristic to identify these raptors all the time because it's highly variable. They do, though, show a very similar shape overall. They have very bowed out secondary wings, feather projections, and also what we like to think of as a candle flame appearance to the wingtips, where it comes out to a little bit more of a point than the other two Buteos. And broad-winged hawks are highly variable in number because certain winds will bring large flocks of them to certain mountains on certain years. So we don't get them every year. We don't get the huge numbers like we did in 2015 when over 16,000 were counted at Pack. We could have as few as 4,000 or 5,000 in some years. Either way, we're going to have thousands of broad-winged hawks unless something crazy happens. And it's already underway. Nearly 2,000 already in the last few days. So as a result, their trend graph is a little more variable. We think they're relatively stable in the east, but there's been some thought that broadwings are declining. So the Harris Center has launched a project to, here's a massive swirl of broad-winged hawks, probably a photo from the tropics, Mexico or Central America, where many hundreds of thousands will bottleneck as they pass through on their way to South America. So yeah, the Harris Center is doing a research project putting transmitters on these raptors. There is one shown here on the right, and we have now 4 raptors that are tagged, giving us movement details. Either cellular or satellite transmitters are showing us how they move. This is a local photo from the Monadnock region of 2 individual birds, a male and a female. The males move a lot more during nesting season, but that's a whole nother presentation. I can't get too deep into that one now. And this show is basically in red. Broad-winged hawks spend their summers in Canada and the US and winter in Central and South America. You can follow our birds, and we'll put up a link to that later on, the bird tracker, which is live now. Every once in a while, we see a rare buteo, such as a rough-legged hawk on top, late season migrant, or a Swainson's hawk here on the bottom, which is a bird from the west. But onto the accipiters, which are smaller raptors with small to medium-sized wings, short rounded wings, and long tails. And for them, they have to do a lot more flapping because migration is kind of hard work. The sharp-shinned hawk has a bit of an S shape to its wings, so S for sharp-shinned, maybe that helps sometimes, but highly variable. And they have typically a squared off tail and a head that doesn't stick out too far in front of its body. They're feisty little guys, as we've determined, and they seem to be decreasing at a lot of hawkwatch sites, even though they are very common. So this is a species of some concern at this point. Its larger cousin, though, the Cooper's hawk, is on the increase. This bird looks very similar to the sharp-shinned hawk, but has a even longer head and a longer tail. Is bigger overall. This is an example of some of the identification challenges we have to deal with on a daily basis at Pack. Sharp-shinned on the right and Cooper's on the left. So these are very slight differences, but you can't say it every time, but usually we get pretty good at determining these characteristics, and the behavior is really a great clue for these guys as well. Sharp-shinned hawks, let's see, Cooper's hawks shown to be declining at Pack, but this might also have to do with climate change and Cooper's hawks not going as far in recent years. I'm going to skip this video for now. Move on to northern goshawk, which is the largest member of the accipiter family. There's been one seen so far this season at Pack. They're pretty uncommon. They show up later in the season, but they also nest in our area. And I'd be very curious to know here if anybody has nesting goshawks in their yard. So send me a message later on, or a note in the chat. Goshawks, this is an adult, by the way, a very gray bird overall, with a very stout, thick body, a powerful bird that hunts snowshoe hares, ruffed grouse, larger birds and mammals in general. And here's a youngster, which has that, again, the brown streaking of juvenile or immature birds. And goshawks definitely declining at a pretty alarming rate, not only in the migration, but in other mechanisms of monitoring, such as the Christmas bird count and bird surveys. Nesting goshawks are disappearing from the south, the southern mountain states, and so we're concerned about them. And the Harris Center did launch a pilot project this spring to try to monitor some of the areas nesting goshawks. So that's why I'm really intrigued about where there might be some, because they were really hard to find. Falcons now. We'll look at the three species of falcons we have. Peregrine falcon is pictured here. It has almost a helmeted appearance when they're in adult plumage, and big dark sideburns that come down the face with a bright white throat area. But generally falcons are long in every proportion. They have long wings, long tails. The wings come to a distinct point. They're really strong flyers, and they're built for both speed and stamina. These are bird hunters of the open country. This is a young peregrine falcon, very heavily streaked bird. They are masters of flight and aerial displays. And here's a pair, I think a local pair from Massachusetts, doing a little bit of a copulation display, I think, as you can see the bands on their legs there. Peregrines have increased, both as a nesting bird and also as a migrant. So we see somewhere in the 50 or so range every year at this point. And then Merlin, which is maybe the least familiar of the falcons to a lot of people, but they're probably the second most numerous at this point. And they're a bird of the northern forests that is expanding its range to the south and has become an uncommon breeding bird in a lot of our region. But Merlins are so fast and feisty. You don't often get a long look at one unless they're perched up on a stick or something, but they just tear after their prey, and they harass a lot of hawks that we're watching during migration too. Seemingly have extra energy to burn. Not all species are blessed with that ability, but Merlins, some people like to say Merlin should be a one-syllable word, because that's how quickly they're flying by the sky. You can't even get the words out. So Merlins are on the increase. And American kestrels, unfortunately, not on the increase. They've been declining for decades, but they're maybe a familiar falcon to many of you. They're very colorful. The male here pictured is different from the female in plumage. So That's something that only a few of our raptors show. The males have bluish gray wings in addition to the reddish orange back and tail, and females have mostly reddish orange overall. There are a few other differences as well, but very bright white underneath overall. A good clue in migration is this this trailing edge of the wing, so the back part of the wing as it's flying has a kind of white dots that we call the string of pearls, a white tip near the tail and next to a black band in some of the adults. So these are just a few of the clues. Generally, they're not flying as quickly as the merlins do. So they spend a little more time through the air. They're not beating their wings as rapidly, and they're a little daintier overall and a little thinner, not as muscular as the merlin. And we are seeing lots of them right now. Oh, these are nighthawks, by the way, just for comparison to the falcons. These are not true hawks, but common nighthawks, which just passed through our area in big numbers, pictured here. They have that falcon-like shape, but they are distinctly different from raptors. So American kestrels, though, as I established, they are declining. Not an alarming trend, but in many parts of their range, they've declined because of the loss of farmland habitat. And at this point, maybe there's some stabilization going on with their range, but the map on the bottom right by the American Kestrel Partnership shows the areas of the country and the Northern Hemisphere where they're declining, and it's pretty red overall. There's a lot of declines. There's not a lot of increasing. So in every part of their range, they've suffered because of farmland habitat loss, nest cavity abundance is not there, and a range of other factors. So as a result, the Harris Center this year has started a new Kestrel monitoring project, partially to raise awareness of the kestrels and their plight, to establish a baseline of what their population is in the region, and to establish a community science-based conservation approach to monitor them year after year. And this has to do with putting up nest boxes. Basically, that is the single best conservation action we can take right now, is putting up suitable nest boxes. So at this point, a lot of people have reached out and are interested in nest boxes. So if you have large fields or are near large fields or know of somebody who would be interested, please reach out. We'd be interested in discussing that with you. And we're looking specifically at the Monadnock region, so mostly Cheshire County and surrounding areas. Looking at habitat suitability right now with an Antioch graduate student and our bird conservation intern. So Will is creating this map that is still in the works, and hopefully this will help guide us to, for management actions in the right places that will make the best difference for kestrels. On to Osprey, the fish hawk. It's a much larger bird than the falcons, long wings, about a 5-foot wingspan, sometimes even larger. They have a tiny little head. You might notice that about them. They seem super long and limby. And they have a distinct M shape in the wing. It looks like you're drawing a letter M here because the wings bend at the wrist noticeably. That's the bird's wrist. They have those dark spots at the wrist as well. And generally they droop their wings. So here's one with the fish, always going head first. That's more aerodynamic. And here's the little bit of the drooped wings appearance. They look like a large gull in flight, and that's a good way to describe them, as a kind of a dark, large gull. They do fly out over the open ocean. This one spent 82 hours over the Atlantic several years back, and was tracked from Newfoundland to South Carolina, showing its exact mileage, over 2,000 miles of flying. So they're amazing flyers. They don't land on the water, so this bird had to just power its way all along. So they're migrating now in large numbers. Unfortunately, the large numbers now are not what they were 10 years ago at Pack. We've seen a pretty significant decline of ospreys. And we're starting to think that bald eagles might be a big part of that decline. They're competing for the same food and the same habitats in breeding season. But that trend is not across its whole range. So we're seeing fewer though. Northern harrier, another bird on the decline, it has characteristics of all of the buteos, the accipiters, and the falcons. It's a little bit more owl-like in its facial disc. You can see a little bit of a facial disc here, kind of like how the barn owl has a facial disc. They have a strong dihedral, which means a V shape in the wings. We will be seeing them getting towards peak pretty soon at the end of the month. This is a female, which is more brownish overall. And then the gray ghost, or the male, known as the gray ghost, is a really striking bird with these dark wing tips and grayish white appearance. They'll migrate later in the season typically, but we'll see them throughout the season as well. We typically see between 60 and 100 or so harriers a year. Right now, our lead counter, Levi Burford, who's been our head counter for the past 4 years on staff, is also a harrier biologist. So he spent all summer tracking breeding northern harriers and has a particular fascination with them. And we're learning new things based on how closely we're studying them. He's trying to age and determine the sex of every migrant harrier, something we haven't really been able to do before this year or before the past couple of years. So that helps us learn about the migration timetables, which might be different for males and females or adults to juveniles. And that might relate to where they're traveling to. So harriers generally going to the southern US. Eagles now. We're all familiar with that bird. Very large birds. They appear very dark at the hawk watch, especially at a distance. Here's an example of a young bald eagle attaining its white tail feathers, but not fully white, and still showing a lot of white in the wings. So suggesting something like a 3-year-old bald eagle here. Eagles are increasing, going literally off the charts in a lot of different ways. Now there are, I just learned there were, I think, 92 territorial pairs in New Hampshire this year. You can see that number has gone up from just one in the late 80s. So they are skyrocketing and really filling out the map all over the state. Increasing at about 11% per year. Golden eagles are a species of the far north. They don't nest in New Hampshire, but they migrate through in some small numbers. This picture shows a juvenile or a young golden eagle. The golden part comes from these hackle feathers behind, or the nape area. That shows a golden nape behind the head. So these feathers sometimes will glow, but the young birds will show white in the wing, but usually just right there in the middle part of the wing, and also white near the end of the tail, easily confused with bald eagles. However, distinctive shape is something that we look for, and golden eagles have a much shorter head than bald eagles do. Bald eagles have more of a 1-to-1 ratio of tail to head length from the wings. Golden eagles, it looks like they have a tiny little head sticking out that's about half the length of its tail. This one is being chased by a red-tailed hawk, showing you the size of these eagles being really large. Turkey vulture, in this case, we have 2 vultures. Somebody asked about vultures before. Turkey vulture is the very common one in this part of the world. They're big, dark birds. They have about a 6-foot wingspan, and they just do a lot of teetering back and forth, a lot of rocking. They don't have to do a lot of flapping most of the time. They take advantage of the winds. They're masters of the wind, and also the sun. So the sun will give them those thermals that they need. They'll start migrating shortly, but there's still a lot of local birds around here. And yes, the black vultures. These 2 were the first 2 black vultures ever recorded at our hawk watch last year. I happened to be there that day and snapped this photo showing the black vultures, which have really short tails and silvery wingtips on otherwise pretty black bodies. Looking at one up close next to a turkey vulture with the reddish head, black vultures have a dark head and feathers go further up the back of the head than they do on a turkey vulture, which is completely bald. So slight size differences, but these are the species increasing from the south, and it's probably going to be part of New Hampshire's breeding birds shortly. So yeah, vultures are generally doing really well. Guess there's a lot of things dying out there in the woods. That's my best explanation for it. Anyway, I think we're getting towards the end here, so I wanted to be able to save a few minutes for questions. But basically, a few ways that you can help here are contributing to our efforts. There are a few websites that I put up here. There's a Harris Center donate website and a list of monitoring sites on Humana's website. So this is different hawk watches that you could find around the country and the hemisphere. And for learning about how to visit Pack Monadnock itself, you'll definitely want to make a reservation, especially for those busy days. Definitely check out that link there if you haven't been up, and we certainly welcome you to the Hawk Watch anytime, and come up and learn from us and share your enthusiasm of raptors. Here's a list of references. Sorry, that got cut off for some reason, but I can find a way to get that out to you. I think that has, I think all of the addresses are there. And for that, I see I'm just about up for time. So Miles, are there some questions that have come in?
There was just a recommendation from KW to watch The Eagle Huntress, which is a documentary. I don't know if you've seen that, Phil. Would you recommend it if you've seen it?
I don't think I've seen it, actually.
Okay. Maybe that's one that we can watch together.
All right.
I'll also say that these links we can include in our follow-up email. That'll include the recording and some of these links that people can explore. No other questions in the chat. I had a couple.
Sure.
The photo that you showed of the black dot in the distance, was that indeed a bald eagle?
It was actually, yeah. But you knew that, right, Miles?
Yeah, that was a tricky one. The ravens that are flying around Pack, are they actually migrating or are they just hanging around?
Good question. At this point of the year, ravens are not doing any sort of distance movement, I call it. I don't want to use the word migration because that's a little bit, it could lead to some question and some inaccuracy. Generally, ravens aren't thought to be as migratory, but they definitely move seasonally and can group up in places, especially for evening roosts like crows do. Crows do migrate. I do know that crows migrate in large groups from parts of their northern range that they can't inhabit in the deepest parts of the winter. But ravens are very capable of being around in all weather. And right now they're enjoying the wind. They're up there soaring, and they'll be around all season in places like that. So hope that answers that question.
Yeah. And we got a question about the northern harriers. Any idea why they might be declining? Yeah,
I know there are whole presentations on that as well that New Hampshire Audubon puts on, as that's a species that they're studying. Generally, though, habitat is a big part of the problem, habitat loss and succession of fields into forests in parts of their range. But it's also a species that's sensitive to accumulating chemicals from eating its prey, of things like snakes, rodents, anything else moving up the line from insects. There's a lot of places that aren't being managed consistent with places that harriers need habitat in proximity to each other. So wetlands and fields with a mosaic of different habitats that support the life that's a little bit lower on the food chain. I think that's one of the big issues, but yeah, development pressures, at least locally, is a big part of that problem.
Gotcha. Well, I got to be respectful of time here. We went a little bit over with that question, but I think it was worth asking. Thanks, Phil, so much for your presentation. I think I've seen this presentation 3 or 4 times. I always learn something new.
Thanks. Yeah, I know it's a lot of information to cover at once, so I would encourage everybody to take a look at the resources. There are a lot of resources within these resources that you could find, books and websites that will provide even more guidance, but there's no substitute for getting out somewhere on your own, and hopefully with us and watching the Hawks either at Pack Monadnock or another opportunity sometime soon. So thank you everybody for joining.
And the thank yous keep coming in. We got a lot of happy people that attended today. So thanks again, Phil. Everybody have a good evening. We'll see you next time.
All right.